Hello. Okay, what I'm going to do is a video on just how to write comparative essays. I'm going to be using the Year 10 task on writing a comparative essay for lesson 13 against either wind, storm on the island, or an awful tempest as an example. However, I'm hoping this video can just be applied to whatever you're doing, because I'm just going to show you basically how to approach this and how to structure your responses. So as you can see down on my taskbar, I've got loads and loads and loads of documents open. These are all of the things that are attached to the task. These include a couple of sheets that I use in my lessons to guide this kind of writing. So I'm going to be using these. So if you wanted to find out where they are, they're just there on the task. So I'm going to be putting my ideas here. And for the purpose of this lesson, I'm going to be looking at An Awful Tempest by Emily Dickinson and Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. I'm not going to analyse those poems in detail because you should have done that previously. So make sure you've got your ideas for those analysis lessons with you, because that will definitely help. So the first thing to do with a comparative essay is focus on what the question is asking you, okay? On what the question is asking. So I need to look back at the question, and I can see that it's asking me to focus on the weather. So that's the first thing I need to think about. Then I need to identify where this is presented in the chosen poems or texts, etc. So I'll just put texts. That basically means find quotes. Okay, for that it just doesn't like when I do that. So what I'm going to do is, I really like a table, but you can do a mind map, you could do several other forms of planning, but I'm just going to do a very basic table. So as I said, my poems are Storm on the Island and Awful Tempest. So I'm going to split that there. I'm just going to center those, because if not it's going to annoy me. Okay, so in Storm on the Island, I'm just going to scan over the poem. That means I'm looking for something in particular, and we know that we're looking for things to do with weather. So our house has got roofs and with good slate, with hay, no stacks nor other trees. When it blows full, okay, when it blows full blast, so I'm going to be using that one. You know what I mean, leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus in a gale. I'm going to highlight that. Pummels, I'm going to highlight that. Sees company exploding comfortably, highlight that. Spits like a tame cat. Savage. Wind dives and strafes invisibly. Space is a salvo. Bombarded. Okay, so I've got some ideas from that one. Now I need to look at the other poem, Awful Tempest. If you didn't know what a tempest is, it's a storm. Okay, so Awful Tempest and mashed the air. Clouds were gaunt, so that means thin. Few black as of a spectre's cloak. Spectre is a ghost. The creatures chuckled on the roofs, whistled, and I'm going to highlight these verbs here. And also just make a note that these are personified elements of the storm. Go back. Warning lit, birds arose, monsters faded eyes. And peace was paradise. So in this poem we can see that it goes from really terrible weather to finally the storm has passed, whereas in Storm on the Island it continues the entire way through. We are bombarded with the empty air, strangers, huge nothing that we fear. So what I then need to do is copy these highlighted quotations into my table. So I'm just going to do that now. Okay, so I've put all of those quotations that I selected into my table, and I've actually closed down those documents now, so I'm just going to have to rely on this. Where there is a capital letter, that is where it's gone over the line. So that's what that is. It's not necessarily just a typo. And you can see that some of them are longer, such as a black as of a spectre's cloak, versus things just like whistled, shook, gnashed, swung, things that are just little parts of a quote that are really effective. So that's a little reminder that when you are selecting quotes to analyse, they don't need to be really long parts of the text. So I need to think about how weather is presented, and looking over these words that I've selected, you can see that actually both poems infer that there is really violent weather going on. So I'm going to put that down here. Both poems show violent weather. However, Storm on the Island doesn't, and Awful Tempest, I'm just going to put AT, does. So I've highlighted something that does change and something that does. Now, looking at this very complicated, which has a typo, brilliant, document that is attached to the task. This is something that I use in my classes for writing a comparative essay, and this one uses 2 war poems as an example. You only need to look at one side, it's just doubled up for printing. So the first thing you need to think about is introducing a synopsis. That's an overview and a summary of the stance, the opinion you're going to be taking. Remember, comparative essays should contain a well-constructed argument, and in your introduction you'll set out your main points that you'll develop later. So if I were you, I'd pause the video now and read over this example. So if you've done that, in this example it goes on to explain both poems, what the attitudes were, and I give some little name drops as to what I'm going to be exploring and the context. So to do that for Storm on the Island and Awful Tempest, you could just show in the poems, remember you need to have capital letters, Storm on the Island. I do apologise, my font doesn't like this use of punctuation, so I'm just going to change it. In poems, Storm on the Island and Awful Tempest, the weather is the main focus, as both texts explore the violent nature and effects that the storm has. However, whilst Storm on the Island continues this throughout, Awful Tempest does not. That is a really straightforward example. Now here obviously I need to put the Awful Tempest, so it's not perfect, but just a little summary. If you were doing this for your poetry anthology or something that you needed context, you could go into talk about when they were written, how that might impair it. For example, Dickinson is notably a very depressed poet, so that might play into it. At the same time, Heaney focuses a lot on the loss of his brother, so you could add that in if you wanted to. Okay, so writing a paragraph then, I'm just going to take you first of all through this P-work structure, this really weird acronym I use, and what that basically means. If you are taught by me or have been, you might recognise this sheet. It might give you a little bit of anxiety and fear whenever I pull these out, because it means that we need to do a bit of extended writing. However, you might have also seen this one. If you haven't seen them before, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to talk you through what that stands for. It's really similar to PEE paragraphs, or you might do Peter paragraphs, Peel paragraphs. They're all the same thing, just different letters. So essentially you need a point, your evidence, and explaining or analysis. And then I've added the reader and the writer. So in my P word, that stands for point, evidence, analysis, writers and readers. We don't need context for this, so forget that bit, okay? Here, I've given you some example sentence starters on how to organise those. Try and think of each letter, P-E-A-W-R, as a sentence that you just need to finish off. So that is what that is, and it adds a little kind of graphic, a little route for you to work around. Okay, so that is what this document is. This one is a little bit more developed for anyone that wants a little bit of a challenge. It's exactly the same. You have in each box sentence starters that you just need to finish off according to the question. Now pay attention to where it says things in brackets, the word, phrase, device. you need to select which one to use. So I'll be using this one for my example. So I need to start off making a point about how weather is presented in these two. So I'm going to start off with one poem. I'm then going to give an example, some analysis, and then I'm going to bring in the other. So if we look at writing a paragraph, my point, the main argument point, then you need evidence from both sources. So my main point is going to be that the storm continues in Storm on the Island, however awful tempest does not. The storm, or you could say actually, the weather in Storm on the Island is continuous throughout the poem. However, the tempest, and I'm going to use that word there, the tempest fades in Dickinson's poem. Now I've put Dickinson's poem to avoid repetition of the awful tempest or to awful tempest, da 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 da. So I've just put that. This is where I then need to think about this part. Okay, this is supported by the quote. This can be inferred from the text, confirms this when it says yada yada yada. I'm going to use one of these because then I can show you how to change it. So here I'm going to pick out a word, phrase or device, firstly from Storm on the Island, because I mentioned it first, that supports the idea that it's continuous. So I'm going to use bombarded, okay, because that word comes later on in the poem. Now, it's not a phrase, it's not a device, so the word, and obviously I need to put the word bombarded, reinforces this notion. Now it wouldn't make sense if I had that. Reinforces this notion in Storm on the Island. Okay, so I've got my point and evidence from the first one. Now I need evidence from the second. So I need however, poem B. So I'll say however. Oh, hold on. I've already used however. So I need a synonym. So I might say, but in awful tempest, that's good, can't spell awful, excellent. In awful tempest, and I need another piece of evidence. This can be inferred from, let's have that one. This can be inferred from, and I'm going to use paradise. Actually, I'm going to use monsters faded. Good, okay, so I've got my point here because I'm saying it's continuous in one, but it fades in the other. I've got my evidence, bombarded, and I've got my evidence, monsters faded. Now I need to look back and think what I need to do next. Analysis, overview of the key language or devices. Are they similar or are they different? Okay, and so some sentence starters for that one can be found in the A box. So I'm going to now think about what kind of word is bombarded. It's a verb. So the verb bombarded, and I need to think about what does that suggest. If you're not sure what it means, remember if you have downloaded this onto your computer, you can just synonym, you can have a look there. You can also smart look up and it will give you the definition of it, which is attacking essentially. The verb bombarded suggests that the weather is attacking the characters in Storm on the Island. Okay, you could think about the characters, you could talk about nature, you could go on a lot further with that. I'm just doing a very basic overview. However, we need to think about that it goes away in this one. So I need another comparative connective. So instead of however, I'm going to put on the other hand, in awful tempest, God, I cannot spell today, tempest, the metaphor, okay, because it's not actually a monster, the metaphor of the monster fading. Okay, now I haven't put quotation marks around fading here because that is not how it's put. If you wanted to use the exact phrasing again, you'd need to think about how to organise your sentence so that it would work. The metaphor of the monster fading reveals that the storm has passed. Okay, so I've done my terminology, I've got metaphor, I've got verb, I've mentioned my quotes again where needed, and I've used a connective. So looking back here, why have the writers done this? Do they have the same intentions? And think about the question and focus again. So I'm just going to remind myself of the question. Comparison of the weather. Okay, you could also think about whether the weather is is aggressive or if it's kind. Okay, so why have the writers done this? Now, as I said, if you were bringing in context, that would really help, but for unseen poetry, you need to practice not having that available to you. So I'm going to put that Heaney could be creating a more dramatic and aggressive poem through the use of the violent weather. Now you'll notice I've put the modal verb could here because I don't want to necessarily limit myself to just one idea, because you could extend it to say, on the other hand, he could be using the weather as an extended metaphor for an emotional or personal issue. That is a really vague sentence, really vague, but I just wanted to show you how you could develop your ideas by using modal verbs. Now I've repeated could, so I'm just going to change that to may because I don't like things sounding really repetitive. So I've done Heaney. I now need to think about Dickinson. So Dickinson, instead of may or could, might be intending to suggest that storms or tempests pass. This could be construed. Now, construed basically means shown, suggests, understood, etc. This can be construed to potentially symbolize emotions passing. Again, a very vague sentence, and I've used potentially because I don't want to limit myself to one idea, and I've just taken the idea that maybe she's saying that things pass. The idea of a storm passing, it could be like a mood, that things are going to get better. So what is the effect on the reader then? Okay, so looking back at this comparative essay sheet, readers, are the intended readers similar, modern versus time period? Again, we don't need context, so don't worry too much about that, but think about how readers would interpret, how they would feel towards each poem. So readers could feel threatened or, oh, that's good, or concerned by Heaney's poem as it is more destructive and continuous, yet they, instead of yet, I'm going to put whilst readers of Dickinson's poem may feel hopeful that storms and their effects will pass. Again, a very vague, I'm writing this off the top of my head, sentence, but here you can see that I've clearly talked about readers of Heaney's and readers of Dickinson's. So I've given you one example of an introduction, one example of a paragraph. Now for this, because we're obviously in very difficult times and you only should be trying to do maybe 30 minutes, feel free to do more, but don't stress yourselves out. It might take you 30 minutes to note down your ideas and try and write an introduction. It could take you 30 minutes to try and write one paragraph. However many you can do, that is really good practice. Okay, so don't worry. Use mine as a guide, but don't copy it exactly. you can see in here where I've talked about Dickinson and Heaney. I've balanced it out. Every time I've mentioned one, I've talked about the other as well. So I hope this has helped. You could go on further to look at how to write a conclusion, but I'd say don't worry about that unless you feel you have talked about everything you can. So I hope this has helped. Remember, this structure and these sheets can be applied to any comparison essay. All you need to do is swap out and finish them using the question you're being asked. Okay, I hope that's helped. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.